Good morning. My name's Rob. For those of you who don't know me, I really think God has been moving among us this morning. That's such a great privilege. But it struck me after we'd been praying for people who need to forgive. If you've been able to begin to do that this morning, then just a word. Don't be surprised if Satan comes to you with a goad in the near future. You didn't really forgive. You can't really forgive that. Just forgive again. Because that breaks the power of Satan to destroy the forgiveness that you'd given. That breaks his power then, if you forgive again. In fact, a vicar once said to his congregation, and I was a part of it, he said, you need to forgive immediately. Even if you forgive through gritted teeth, to start with, start the process of forgiveness. So, end of first sermon. We're continuing in our study through the book of Judges, and we come this week to Samson. And like Adam last week, he had two or three chapters to go through. We've got 3 chapters to look at this week, so we're not going to go through it in great detail. And I think probably the first chapter I'll go through as quickly as I can to give us more time. After the previous judge, Abdon, died and was buried, it says the Israelites again sinned. And so God brought them into bondage under the Philistines for 40 years. They suffered for 40 years being occupied and subjected to the Philistines. And then an angel of God appeared to a woman. We don't even know her name. A married woman, and said, you're barren. You're going to have a baby. Not the first time, and not the last time that's happened in the scriptures. She goes and tells her husband, Manoah, who appears to be a very humble man and a very trusting man, but I suspect not the brightest bulb in the box when it comes to his relationship with God, because he asked God to send the man again, and God answered that prayer, but they didn't recognize that it was an angel of God to start with, and he offered all the normal customary things to a visitor. The angel refused to eat, but said offer a sacrifice. And it was only when the sacrifice was lit and burnt and the angel disappeared into heaven in the sacrifice that the penny dropped, and he suddenly said, seen God. And he seems to take on a bit of Private Fraser, if you're a Dad's Army fan. We're doomed, he says. We've seen God, we're going to die. And if I may say, ladies, with particular feminine logic, his wife said, if God was going to kill us, he wouldn't have accepted a sacrifice, would he? And you can imagine Manoah going, oh. That really covers the first chapter, so we can move on to chapter 14. The boy was born, obviously, Samson was born, and right at the end of the previous chapter it says the Spirit of God began to move in Samson. So far, so good. Chapter 14 obviously jumps ahead a few years, because we now find Samson as a young man. And it says he went down to Timnah and saw there a young woman. Well, fine, but it actually says a young Philistine woman, a member of the occupying power, the enemy. He saw this woman. When he returned home, he said to his father and mother, I've seen a Philistine woman in Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife. What I didn't say, about the previous chapter was that the angel had said that he was to be a Nazirite from birth. Now, the Nazirite vow was something that God had given the Israelites that they could take for themselves for a specific purpose, for a specific period of time. They might commit to, 3 months of work for God in a specific area. One of the signs of that was that they would have uncut hair during the whole time of their vow. Looks like Adam's just finished a Nazirite vow. We'll find another one for him. But Samson was committed from birth. And here we find, as a young man, he's doing something that God specifically forbade the Israelites to do, was to intermarry with other races. He wanted them to marry within their own people so that they could be the people of God. So, what's happened to that Nazirite vow? Well, he obviously didn't feel it very strongly, did he? And it reminded me that, he took a Nazirite vow, and so he was specifically God's person. But we're all God's person. You are God's person. You may not feel like it, you may not recognize it, but you are God's person. Paul tells us in the book of Ephesians that we were all chosen for a specific purpose in God's plans. You have a specific purpose in God's plans. He's got a specific plan for you. You are God's man or God's woman. We all are. And here's Samson, who would have been brought up knowing that he was a Nazirite, knowing that he was specifically God's man, basically flagrantly ignoring it. Flagrantly ignoring it. And there was a verse that I wanted to skip over, but God said, no, you have to address it. And it's verse 4 in this chapter. And it says this, when he said, get this woman for my wife, it says his parents didn't know that this was from God, who was seeking an occasion to confront the Philistines. And I struggled with that because that sounded as though he was God telling him he was a Nazirite, he's got to be separated, he should uphold the highest principles of God, and yet it appears that God is saying, do something else. But there is a principle throughout Scripture and throughout our lives. God does not cause us to disobey any of his rules or anything that he has said in here. God does not ever cause us to do that. And I actually looked in a commentary and it pointed out that this was in brackets. And the suggestion is that this was just an editorial note put in by the author of Judges, possibly Samuel, saying this is what he thought the situation was, because in the end, God did actually do a work through Samson. But it's not specifically saying that God caused Samson to do that, because that just wouldn't be true. I suspect it was Samson, who was obviously headstrong, chose to do that. And sorry, this is deja vu. I've said this during our study in Judges. Adam alluded to it last week, where God says, if you're determined to do that, you carry on. You carry on and do it. And there's an encouragement for us, really, I think. If we've messed up, if you feel you've messed up and God can't use you, yeah, it'll have consequences, but it doesn't mean God ditches you. It doesn't mean he won't ever use you again. And the challenge is that we need to come back to him and say sorry. The technical term is repentance, but that always sounds like a visit to the dentist to me. It's just saying sorry and meaning it. he can still use us, even when we mess up. And so, reluctantly, Manoah arranges with this Philistine family for their daughter to marry Samson. And they go down to have a feast. And Samson's obviously a bit of a wind-up merchant because the family show hospitality. Samson organises a feast which lasts 7 days. I thought weddings today were long enough, where they have the ceremony, then they have one meal, then they have another disco in the evening. I think that's long enough. Their wedding ceremonies lasted 7 days. And the toughest bit of that seems to me to be that the marriage was only consummated on the 7th day. You're all this time anticipating it, and you have to wait till the 7th day. But the Philistines provided 30 men to be his companions, as was the norm during that time. And he's obviously a bit of a wind-up merchant because he sets them a challenge. He gives them a puzzle. But even here, I think there's some negativity about it because, Adam and Andy and I wind each other up all the time as elders, but I trust there's never any animosity in it. I trust Adam doesn't mean what he says. Oh, you do? Oh, all right. Well, he was nodding his head. And they get really upset about this. So they go to his wife and they say, look, you get your husband to tell us the secret. You find out the secret of this puzzle. And then tell us. And they don't just ask in a pleasant way. They say, otherwise, we're going to burn you and your father to death. They're a friendly bunch, the Philistines, by the sound of it. And I'm sorry, ladies, I did pay you a compliment earlier, but I can just imagine, because what happened was this. For the rest of the feast, for about 3 or 4 days, she cried and cried and cried, wanting Samson to let her in on the answer. And I can just imagine her saying, oh, for goodness sake, woman, stop it. Be quiet. And eventually he caved in and told her. And she told the 30 guys. I mean, she was, threatened by them. But I think for me, the thing we need to look at comes in verse 19. Where it says Samson burning with anger. What Samson did was actually to go out and kill some Philistines in order to fulfill the promise that he'd made these guys fulfill. But then it says burning with anger. He went up to his father's house. Because he'd lost this wager. Because he'd been made to look stupid. And we see that Samson was angry, he was rash, he was self-centered, he was churlish, and he just threw his toys out the pram and went home to mum and dad. What was it we said about consequences when you mess up? Did he anticipate that for the end of his wedding ceremony? He didn't even consummate his marriage. And the consequences of that were that he didn't get his bride. And so we come to chapter 15, and the lessons don't appear to have been learned. He just doesn't get it, Samson. It starts off by saying, later on, at the time of the wheat harvest, Samson took a young goat and went to visit his wife. He said, I'm going into my wife's room. but her father wouldn't let him go in. I was so sure you hated her. He said, I gave her to one of the companions. You can have her younger sister. She's probably prettier. Samson said to them, this time, I have a right. I have a right to get even with the Philistine. I have a right. It's amazing how much we can justify because we think we've got a right. I've got a right to do this. I've got a right to do that. I mean, I've quite often heard people say, well, these days you don't have any choice, do you? You've got to do this. It may be dishonest, but you've got to do it. No, you haven't got to do it. If it's dishonest, you haven't got to do it. We don't have a right to do that. I don't have a right to drive down Pinehurst Road at 50 miles an hour. I don't have a right to drink 5 pints, not that I could manage 5 pints anyway, but I don't have a right to drink 5 pints and then go out and drive my car. No, I don't. I don't have those rights. I might try and take those rights, but I don't have them. And Samson didn't have a right to be proud here because he caused the trouble in the first place. And I was reminded that Paul actually quotes the Old Testament in Romans chapter 12, and he says, God says, it's mine to avenge. I will repay. But that doesn't give me that satisfaction when I get my own back on him, does it? But you know what? That satisfaction is short-lived. But what I can promise is when you leave things in God's hands and let God deal with the issue, the satisfaction after God deals with it is so much more, so much longer lasting, so permanent, so much greater, so much better. It does demand patience. You have to wait for God's time. And I just wish God would hurry up in those situations. But he uses his own time. And instead of letting God deal with it, he took his own revenge. And what he did was to go out and catch a whole load of foxes or possibly jackals, because they hunt in packs, so it would have been easy to catch a large number. And he tied them tail to tail and then lit a fire between them and then sent them into the Philistines' wheat harvest and into their vineyards and their olive groves. And they obviously burnt the whole lot and destroyed their harvests. So when the Philistines asked, who did this? They were told it was Samson. So the Philistines went up and burned the Timnite and her father. They burnt them to death. Did Samson start off wanting to marry this woman, believing it would end up like that? Of course he didn't. He thought it was going to be brilliant. He was looking forward to his bride. But it was his pride and his lack of commitment to God, his lack of willingness to follow God, that led this vicious spiral getting worse and worse and worse. What do we see in several parts of the world today? And I guess the Middle East is the one that comes to mind first. But a vicious spiral where both sides claim the justification for taking the actions that they take. And remember, Samson was a man called by God. And the violence continues through this chapter. And eventually Samson kills 1,000 of them with a donkey's jawbone, because one of Samson's abilities is his strength. And the violence and the death and the battles go on. And then we come to verse 20, where it says, if I can see it, yeah, I must get my eyes tested, or a bigger Bible. Samson led Israel for 20 years in the days of the Philistines. Isn't it amazing that God still used him? Such a useless, faltering, self-centered, miserable bloke, basically. And yet God still used him. Was it how God wanted to use him? No. That's very doubtful. God had a much better plan, and the end results would have been far better for Israel, far better for Samson. Might not have been so good for the Philistines, but they were the occupying power. Which brings us sort of back almost to the beginning. You see, just because God calls us, he doesn't make us perfect. We are what we are. And just because we're not perfect, it doesn't mean God can't use us. God works with what he's got. So don't sit there thinking, yeah, well, I'm useless. I do this, I can't handle this. I can't serve God. That's not true. That's the devil talking. Because if he can keep you down in that position, believing that you are useless to God, then he hasn't got to worry about you. Much better to give the devil a headache and let God use you, warts and all. It's too easy to drift through life like Samson just because we're not perfect. It doesn't mean God can't use us. And forget that we are called both individually and collectively as a church. See, God's got great plans for this church. And if you're part of this church, he's got great plans for you in this church. Okay, Samuel and Mary feel called to go back to Devon. So God's got great plans for them down there. We're sorry to see them go. But we're glad if they're doing God's will. We're glad if God's in that. And he's going to use them down there. But God's got great plans for this church and for us as part of this church. But we have this battle within us, don't we? And I read the other day, and it was in my quiet time on Friday, I think, a really good illustration of this. It's like two dogs fighting within us. One dog symbolizes negativity, ungodly qualities, envy, pride, greed, anger, selfishness, and arrogance, and so on. The other dog's qualities are positive and godly, including love, joy, kindness, humility, self-control, grace, tolerance, etc. If you want to read a few more, have a look at 1 Corinthians 13, verses 4 to 8. They all come under the title of love. So those two dogs battle within us. So which dog's going to win? Well, it's the dog we choose to feed. It's going to win the battle. We choose the attitudes that nourish the dogs within us, and they determine which dog wins. And that determines the outcome of what we become. And I found it quite interesting since reading that. And it was only towards the end of the week. I keep pulling myself up and saying, which dog am I feeding? Which dog are you feeding? And I found it quite a challenge. Because we have a lot to offer. But only in God's power and only in God's strength. And when you fall and fail, and you will, and I will, we remember that we need to come back and say sorry to God. In fact, Paul tells the church in Corinth that we've got this power, God's power through his Spirit within us, in what he calls jars of clay. Because that means we can show the all-surpassing power of God as we serve him. So God gets the glory rather than us. And you know what clay pots are like? I mean, I've got several in the garden after last winter with wire around the top to stop them falling apart where they've cracked in the frost. We're a bit like that at times, aren't we? And in fact, Paul was too. Because he says in Romans, I'm a wretched man. I do the things I don't want to do, and I don't do the things that I want to do. So don't be discouraged, be encouraged that no matter who you are, God wants to use you. We just need to come to him and allow him to work through us. And we've seen God working through people here this morning. Tremendous morning. I just want to go back now to the verse we started with in John 15, where Jesus said, you are the branches. You're the branches. I'm the vine. You are the branches. What Adam read at the beginning. Remain in me. And that's where we need to be. Now, I've heard Samson described in the last few weeks as the best of a bad bunch of the judges and the worst of a bad bunch of the judges. I'll leave you to choose which you think he was. Andy's going to finish off Samson's life next week, and I don't want to steal his thunder, but it doesn't get any better. Thanks, Amy.